Hi, I'm Dan from Peerless Props, and in this video we're going to be making not one, not two, but three Wookie Bowcasters from Star Wars The Force Awakens.
Hey, can I try that? I like this thing.
So why three? I wanted to make three different props and see which was the most worth it for the amount of money spent. One was made entirely from scrap and cost around £30. One was 3D printed and cost around £200. And one was made using the best materials and equipment I could find and cost me over £1,000. See if you can guess which is which. First up, we have the one made of scrap. So for this one, I wanted to make the entire thing out of household items or items that anyone can acquire really easily and use only tools that pretty much everyone has access to. So we started off with a bunch of trash. I live in a big apartment building, so most of these items were acquired from the apartment's recycling bin. But you could just as easily get them from a shop that's throwing things out or anywhere really. The main body of the gun was cut out from a large cardboard box and then scored along the top and folded over. These cardboard pieces were for the bits on the side of the gun here. This area is built up in 3 different levels, so I cut these out and then glued them underneath the existing body. For all the gluing on this bowcaster, I used a glue gun. Now this is not something that everybody already has, but you can get one from pretty much any hobby store for like 10 quid. For the stock, I needed it to have something rigid in the core, as cardboard by itself probably wouldn't have been strong enough and would have just bent or ripped or something like that. So I decided to use a coat hanger. I cut this out just using a bread knife to score it to the point where you could snap it. Once all the individual pieces were cut out, they were just stuck together with little globs from the glue gun. While the coat hanger made a nice strong core, it wasn't nearly thick enough for what I wanted, so I used this polystyrene packaging that I found whilst dumpster diving to add some thickness to it. Once I'd made the stock, I needed to fill out the main body in the middle so that it wasn't just a shell. To do this, I used the polystyrene again, just cut out into little squares and then sandwiched in the middle of the cardboard. As you can see, it's finally starting to resemble something like the original prop. However, I now needed to patch up all the holes so that it was one solid piece. For this, I just cut strips of cardboard to the right width and glue gunned them into the gaps. I then repeated this process on the stock. The receiver was just one single piece of cardboard folded around into an oblong and then closed off at the end, and then slapped on top of the main body. The barrel was the first material that I had to buy. It was just a piece of PVC pipe from the local hardware store, which I'll need to check the receipts, but it only cost me a couple quid. We just cut this down to size with a craft knife and then slid it into the receiver on the top. With that, the main body of the gun was starting to take shape. However, I needed to fill in all these pesky bits where the corrugated card was kind of showing through. To do this, I just added a thin layer of glue from the glue gun and then spread it out so that it was just covering the corrugation. With the main body pretty much done aside from all the details, it's time to move on to the scope. To do this, I used a variety of different household rolls, all the way from the kitchen to the shitter. I cut these out to the right length, but then, as you can see, since they're all different diameters, they wouldn't fit together quite right, so we had to wrap cardboard around the smaller tube until the bigger tube would fit over the top perfectly. And then, with the help of a bit of editing, I did the same for the scopes on the side. Next up was all these little details. For this, I just used a bunch of buttons. Now, if you had enough buttons around the house, you could just use some you already own, or I ended up buying some from a craft shop for like £1. The scope was then attached by cutting a little hole into the receiver at the top and folding more corrugated card into some oblongs to attach to the scope. The last details that needed to be added to the main body were the iron sights and the muzzle right at the front. The iron sights were just folded cardboard, and the muzzle was another slightly thicker piece of pipe just from the hardware store, again not more than a couple pounds in cost. The bowline was made from garden wire, because like the stock it needed to be quite sturdy, but unlike the stock I also needed to be able to shape and form it. I bent 4 pieces of the wire into shape and then taped them all together. After I had the basic shape modelled, I got some white card from the local hobby shop. This is not quite as thick and a lot more flexible than the cardboard that I'd used for the main body, so that I could bend it around the shape much easier. Last but not least were the spheres on the ends of the bowline. These were made from the capsules from a little gacha toy machine. They cost me £1 each. And I got a little fluffy dog as the toy, if anyone was wondering. I cut a groove in each half with the craft knife so that the bowline could slide in. And with that, the building was finished. To paint it for the base coat, I just used cheap black acrylic paint and brushed it on with an old brush. Since this was scrapped together and made from bits and bobs and rubbish, I wanted it to look like it was heavily used and battle scarred. To do this, I used some silver airbrush paint, but any silver paint would do, and dry brushed it on all over. I also dry brushed on some dark brown to give it a dirty, gritty sort of look. And that's this one finished. Here's some shots of the completed piece.
Like the ones we heard, like the 100 stains on your dirty shirt, and when you dance, it's American gold, only worth half price. If you have, then you hold. Oh, you don't know, blame it on her. You don't know.
If you guessed that the middle one was the one made from scrap, you were right. This one only cost me a total of £32 in the end, and this could be brought even lower if you had some more of the materials already. Up next, we're going to make the expensive one out of all the tools at my disposal. Which of the two lefts do you think it is? I used the same blueprint for both the scrap one and this one. The link to it will be in the description if you wanted to download it for yourself. First up, we needed to cut out the basic shape. This was just 3 sheets of MDF stuck together to get the right thickness, and then roughed out using a combination of a jigsaw and a drill. After I had the basic shape all glued together, I needed to smooth it out and carve out all the bits that the jigsaw couldn't get to. For this, I used a combination of a Dremel and a hand file, and then some high grit sandpaper at the end to give it a nice finish. The receiver was made from 3 sheets of MDF, same as the main body, and then I needed to add in these little details with some thin 3mm MDF, and then the barrel was some metal pipe cut down to size.
Devils to your soul, singing, where have all your angels gone? So tell me what to do, tell me what to do. Oh, 'cause you're all I knew.
Next up, we needed to make the little barrel rest thing at the front, and since it's kind of an irregular shape, I thought the best thing to use would be some epoxy putty. This is a 2-part clay-like substance that dries hard in about 2 hours or so, and can then be sanded into pretty much any shape you like. With the main body of the gun put together, it was time to move on to the stock. Since this part's a lot thinner and needed to be much sturdier, I decided to make it out of a hardwood, in this case ash, instead of MDF, which would likely have snapped. We joined it to the main body using a mortise and tenon joint, to prove that I did in fact actually learn something in woodworking at school.
All your angels gone. So tell me what to do, tell me what to do.
Then I needed to add all the little grooves and details on the side of the blaster. This was roughed out with a Dremel, and then finished off with a hand sander to get a nice finish. The big groove on the side was done with a router attachment on the Dremel. Iron sights were made by wrapping a thin piece of steel around a circle of wood, and then the muzzle on the end was just a slightly thicker metal pipe than the barrel, because who doesn't love thick pipe? Next up was the actual bow limb for the bowcaster. This again was made out of ash to make sure it was nice and sturdy. After finishing up the bow limb, we needed to patch up some holes and little missing bits with some more epoxy putty. To attach the bow limb to the main body, I cut a groove in both of them, and then slid them together like Luke and Leia before they knew they were siblings. The last main piece of construction to do is the scope and the flashlight on the top. For the flashlight, I decided to turn this on my lathe, mostly just because I haven't used it in ages. Also, since I live in a fairly small apartment, I don't actually have anywhere to put a lathe, so I ended up just using it on the patio outside. Probably not the best safety, but Mr. Wingate isn't around to have a go at me anymore. I turned this using one of the cheap off-cut blanks from my local timber merchant, so I don't actually remember what it was. This could have also been done in a number of different ways, but I'm pretty happy with how it came out in the end. Since I wanted the scopes to actually be functional, I bought 2 airsoft scopes that were the closest match to the ones on the original prop that I could find, and I think they came out pretty well. Now for the scope mount, since I wanted it to be an exact replica of the original prop and a custom size, it would have been an absolute bitch to make by hand. So while I was trying to avoid 3D printing and kind of hand make this was the only part I felt I had to, really. And since the point of this build was to try and use all of the tools I have to make the best possible outcome, I felt it was fair.
So your education couldn't do you right, and you've lost control of everything inside. It's a conversation we can try and try.
I attached the scope mount with another mortise and tenon joint, and then all that was left to do was add in the details. On the original prop, the spheres on the end of the bow limbs aren't quite actually spheres. They've got this little protruding bit in the middle. So to make these, I got 2 half-round dowel spheres and then glued them together with a little plyboard circle in the middle that protrudes out a little bit further than the half spheres. I also used the spheres to attach the bowstring by just threading them through the hole and then gluing them in with the spheres. Turns out I lied about the scope mount being the only 3D printed part. I also had to 3D print these little greebly detail bits on the side, as again, couldn't think of any other way to make them exactly the same without a whole lot of unnecessary effort. And that's the construction all finished. Time for paint. I primed it with a Rust-Oleum red surface primer. After priming it, despite the original prop being entirely black, I coated the whole thing in Vallejo's metal colour duraluminium. This is so that after we paint it black, we can scratch back a little bit of the paint with some sandpaper to reveal the silver and leave it with kind of a battle damaged, used look, which will be more realistic than trying to add in the damage after painting it black. Here, as mentioned, I'm just sanding away the top layer to reveal the silver underneath. I tried to focus on the areas that I thought would get chipped and damaged if it was actually being used as a real gun. I used 1200 grit sandpaper for this, as I only wanted to scratch away just the black and leave all the other colours underneath as they are. And with this little side-by-side comparison of before and after the weathering, that's it, it's done.
She's not shy and we're not coy. Coke-hung babies and sidewalk noise. There's no future and there's no past.
2 down, 1 to go. This one cost me a total of £165 in materials and a total of £865 for a combined total of £1,030. Now obviously you could adjust this for any tools that you already have or any materials that you have lying around, but if you were to try and replicate this from scratch with no tools and no materials, this is roughly how much it would cost. Last but not least, we have the 3D printed one. The file was downloaded from Thingiverse, I'll put the link to it in the description. The total print time for all the parts was around 100 hours, so about 4 days of non-stop printing. I used PLA to print this, and printed it in 24 pieces. In the end it used about 580 grams of filament, which comes out to roughly about £11 for the cost of the filament. It was all attached together using a combination of pegs and 2-part epoxy. So there we have it, 3 different bowcasters. But which one came out the best? I was actually really surprised at how well the scrap-built one came out, given how little it cost. The only problem with this one is it is far and away the least durable of the 3. You can already see I've chipped the paint on it a little bit there. But from a distance, it looks just as good as the others. If you already have a 3D printer, 3D printing is the cheapest and least hassle option, as filament is cheap and the 3D printer does pretty much all the work. However, I don't think it looks as good as the other 2. Lastly, I do think the expensive one looks the best, but if you don't have access to a lot of tools, it's not the sort of thing that most people would be able to make. This one will be available on my Etsy store if you were looking to purchase one. And if you made it this far, thanks a lot for watching, and tell me which one you think looks the best.